Hi, welcome back to Learn Agile Practices. This is my weekly Pomodoro podcast, and I'm also back with English episodes. Today, it's even more important for me nowadays to keep producing episodes in English because I'm no longer working in an international company at the moment. I'm currently working for an Italian startup now, so I'm not daily working in English. So keep producing these podcasts also in English, alternating right every week. The language will help me in practicing English continuously. So this is even more important for me. And today I'm here to talk about monorepos. In this new experience that I started in October, I'm working in a monorepo context and it's my first time. So I thought that it was a good idea to make some reflection on how these months went working on a monorepo and what are my feelings and my pros and cons about using a monorepo approach. So that's the topic for today. But as always, before starting, let's go with the jingle. Okay, so as I was saying, I changed job recently in October. I joined an Italian startup, and here the project, which already has 1 year of life before I joined, well, it's a monorepo project. And it's my first time working in a monorepo context. So it's interesting, and I'm the technical leadership of the team, so I had to learn that, and it was one of the first things that I had to face when I joined and then I started to work with the project to learn how to handle the monorepo approach and how it was configured in our context. Before going into my opinions about the monorepo, at least for the current configuration we have in our project, I want to give you some context about the project itself because, of course, since it's my first time in a monorepo, my opinions are only based on these 4 months and some articles I read online. So it's important that I share with you the context before I share the opinions so you can put them in the right context, right? And I also hope that in the comments, some of you might come and give me a different point of view about the cons that I saw, or even the pros, and maybe some suggestion from some of you that are more expert than me in monorepos. I would happily read uh, such kind of comments. So our project, as I said, it's a monorepo, and it's first of all, it also has one single language, programming language, which I believe because I didn't have any other experience nowadays, but I believe that it's the easier situation, right, for a monorepo because I can easily think about some additional complexity that might come in a monorepo where every sub project has different programming languages. In this case, everything is in TypeScript. So single programming language. We have basically 4 projects at the moment: the front end, the back end, the back office, and the design system. And we basically have these 4 different projects: 2 React application, the back office and the front end, back end in a Nest.js backend, and a design system in Storyboard. And yeah, we share the programming language, we share the dependency management. We use Turbo as the manager for the monorepo, which, as far as I know, is the de facto standard for the TypeScript context for a monorepo approach. And the first feeling I had was pretty good. The first feeling I had was pretty good. Why is that? Well, because the setup of the project was pretty easy. Not everything was automated. I had to receive the first dump manually, I believe, if I remember correctly. We still have some problems in the project that are not related to it being a monorepo, but the setup itself, the configuration, the fact that everything could be installed with the same package manager, it was pretty easy, right? No different setup and repositories for every part of the full application, but just one single Git clone and turbo and pnpm install, I believe, and then just a turbo run for. And you can also run them all together in a single command, or you can run every piece, so the backend, the front end, and the back office mainly, in three different commands. So you can also, you have some space, right, to manage it as you prefer. And there's also the opportunity to share the pnpm version, the package manager version, and a lot of configuration are shared. There's also a missing opportunity, I believe, because there are no types shared, but this is something that I will come back later. So the first feeling was pretty good, right? Then I tried to make the first change, and that also was pretty straightforward. The first weird thing, not weird, but not ideal in my head situation, was about the pipeline. When I tried to release the first time, what was happening was that I made a small change in the front end and everything was released, because we currently have one single logic in the GitHub Action pipeline configuration where we basically build everything, test everything, and deploy everything for every commit in the master branch. So this is the overall configuration of the system. And as I said, it was pretty easy to notice some pros and cons immediately. And I made myself an opinion, a first opinion after 4 months working in this context, that I want to share with you to make a reflection about. First super pro that I can easily see is code reuse. It's super easy to share internal libraries in a monorepo context, right? It's just an additional project in the monorepo, but you have it and you can import it in the other projects, especially in a situation like ours where there is the same programming language and basically the same versioning dependency system. And I mean, it's super easy. You can just build, for example, a shared npm, a shared library, and you don't need to publish it on npm to share it between your projects, because you just have it in the monorepo. And this has a lot of use cases, right? The first one that we use it is the design system. We can easily create a design system as a sub project, and then it's there, available for everyone, can be important for everyone, and you don't need to publish it somewhere else in a private repository somewhere, etc. So it's super easy. There's also a missed opportunity here, in my opinion, because another thing that there are a lot of things that we could share, for example, between backend and front end, and we don't. The main example in my head is about the types for the request and the responses. In a previous experience, I wanted to solve this problem, right? So we work in continuous integration and we want to continuously release. So usually a first good idea is that front-end and backend share the request and response, right? And then they are basically independent. If we do that only via an open API specification, we only have a documentation that serves the purpose. But I want to have code, running code. And in TypeScript, we can just share types. We can define a type for the request, a type for the response, and then we can just use them in both front end and backend, right? And I was working in this previous experience, I was working in a PHP backend in Laravel, and I imported and customized a library that was converting PHP data class into types for TypeScript. And then I built an automation that every time we tried to release, he was taking every data class that was implementing the request or response interface and turn it into a TypeScript type, build a TypeScript library with all the types, and publish it on npm and make it available for the front end in a private npm registry. And it was amazing, even if we have all that friction given from the fact that we had to publish the library on the npm registry and then download the new version, etc. And it was a big friction, but still we could see the power of what we was doing, right? We had now a way to automate and be 100% sure that the HTTP request would be successful, right? Maybe there could be some business logic that we need to fix, but the request itself, how I make a request, how he will respond back, we are sure that we have a type sharing that structure, so we cannot make a mistake. And I mean, we still don't do it, but it would be super much easier to share these kind of types in a monorepo situation, especially in our situation where we also share the programming language, right? Because we can just build a library where we have all the request and response types, and both front-end and backend can use it. Super easy. Even if it wasn't TypeScript, we could just build the automation that transform the data object in a specific programming language in a type in TypeScript or in Dart or any other language you are using for the front end or the mobile application, but we don't need to publish it in a private registry anywhere else. We just need a sub-project in our Monorepo where we go to update the automated generated types, right? So it's super easier, and I really want to do that even more. As I was saying, using a monorepo in a shared language context makes it even easier to work in a monorepo, in my opinion, because you don't have, you have consistency, right? In every project, in every sub-project in the monorepo. It makes it easier to collaborate and work full stack between front-end and backend because the front-enders and back-enders are sharing the same programming language, so they can more easily talk to each other technically, right? And also share feedback and pieces of code and collaborate on code together. So that's also a big pro. I love to make the team work in paired programming or ensemble programming, mob programming. So the fact that we are using the same programming language makes it a lot easier to talk about code, even when we are touching backend and there is the front end in the pair or in the session participating, and vice versa. So sharing a single language can have a big pro from this point of view. The setup, as I was saying before, was probably the easier I ever faced because it was just one. I faced some struggles, but then once I did the first good setup, everything was working together because it's a monorepo, right? So when you start one, you start all of them. Probably these might not be, there's nothing guaranteeing you that in a monorepo with a single setup you can make everything work, probably. But I think this is one of the points of the monorepo. So I believe that if you do a monorepo, you should give yourself the target of having a single command to install everything and a single command to make everything run. Then, if you need it, you can build smaller commands to make just one piece run in case you need it, but you also need the global one for sure. Another point that I can consider a pro is that when you make a change, you build a feature or you change something in an existing feature, and then you create a branch, open a pull request, eventually merge it or commit directly to master, and then release to production. We do that by tagging the code. Well, everything you do on Git or on your subversion control system, it's global. So you make one commit in the repository, and that commit is identifying all your pieces of software in a specific moment of time. Because in that commit, you have your changes, but then you also have the global state of everything. So when you commit something, you're building a new state for the entire application, not only for the front end or for the back end, but for the entire application. So this is a big pro in a certain way and from a specific point of view, because I mean, if you need to imagine you need to add a field to an API and then use it to show a new data in a table, right? You can make a single pull request where everything is added in the front end and in the back end. Then when you merge it, everything works. This is nice from one side, but I think it's also risky on the other side. I think this can also be a cons. And it's probably my first cons, actually, because there is some value in keeping the front end and the back end especially, but I mean the project, the sub-project of an application that is made by multiple services, independent. In the last years, I always treated front end and back end like if they were sort of a microservice, to be honest. What I mean is, I mean, if you do microservices, doing it properly, well, every service, every microservice should be independent. So if microservice A needs some data from B and B is down, A should work. Maybe with older data because B is not available, so you cannot get the latest one. Maybe with, I don't know, a queue that tell the user that everything is okay and just keep the work to be done from B in a queue, and it will be done when B is back working. There are multiple ways to achieve that, but the concept is that A should work even if B is not working. And usually I keep this approach also in the front end and the back end. I mean, for the back end is mandatory, right? Because the back end needs to work independently from others. Any front end that make use of its API, but also the front end should generally work, even if the back end is not working. You might even push yourself and build a local first application that works locally and then sync with the backend, and then you can 100% make it work even without the backend. And I usually take advantage of types in the request and response to make developing front-end and backend something you can do independently. This gives some value, I believe. I think it's also easier to do continuous integration, not to do, but maybe to think about doing continuous integration and doing trunk base when you have separated repositories, because there are some hard limits that are pretty clear and evident, and so you cannot make a mistake from that point of view. If backend and frontend are separated, it's easy to see that if you make a breaking change, it will be breaking for sure because they are merged in a different moment. When you are in a monorepo, you know that you can make a single change where frontend and backend change together. So you might be more tempted to make bigger changes. And I love trunk-based development and continuous integration. So every time I see a temptation to make a bigger change, a bigger commit, I need to slow down. The smaller the steps, the better, in general, in any best practice. And so this is a bit worrying, right? Because the monorepo context brings some temptation to make bigger steps, to make something that is more dangerous. And when you do continuous integration, trunk-based, and test-driven development, everything is about doing the less risky, reduce the risk. So this is in conflict, right? You need to be very, very good and very, very careful when you are in a monorepo context if you want to do continuous integration and trunk based, because the monorepo is a big temptation of doing a big step of development. Some other cons of the monorepo, in my opinion, are the additional tooling needed. Of course, in our case, it's Turbo, but I think in other contexts there might be a different dependency on a tool that makes it easier to work in a monorepo. The tool is needed because they provide some useful command to handle the monorepo, but also it's an additional dependency, something else that you need to learn how to use. So you need to consider the overhead. if no one has experience in the team. There is also something about the release to be said. I think that a configuration like ours, where every commit makes the pipeline build and release everything, so a small change in the front end will trigger a release in the back office and in the back end also. It's acceptable at first, but I think it becomes easily wrought very, very fast. It's overkill to release everything when the change is a small change in a single item, in a single repository, in a single project. So ideally, you should build a setup where you just release what's changed. And maybe you can force with a specific command that you release everything just to realign everything in case something gets unaligned. But in general, it's better to go and release just what's changed. And this can also optimize the pipeline, and because the release would be faster for sure. So also the pipeline configuration needs some love and needs some work. And in general, I feel that the monorepo brings another engineering risk. The monorepo itself is an additional piece of engineering, and I think you should use it to solve a problem. I think the bigger problem that is solving for us is having a single and simpler setup, and makes it easy to share libraries between the projects. The best example, in my opinion, is the design system. And we are also powered from the fact that we use TypeScript for every project. But there are some things that needs to be customized, that needs to be improved, and I wouldn't probably started with a monorepo if I was here, so it's not necessarily the best choice. And as an additional thought, I think it also makes you think. Once you have a monorepo, it can make you think that you can also have a monorepo inside a monorepo and being it a good idea. I don't know if it's only us, but in our case, for example, also the backend is splitted in subsystem, and this split is totally nonsense in my opinion. It doesn't follow any domain-driven design principle. It's just a technology split that doesn't add any much value, and I think it was done just to be coherent with the monorepo approach in the full project. And I think that in general, the monorepo makes it more tempting to do over engineering in some pieces of the project. So you need to be careful. I'm not saying it's fault of the monorepo, but I'm saying that it's a context where it's easy to think to bigger and more complicated things and solutions. And in general, as a developer, we want to minimize complexity in code. So it's something that we need to consider. I would probably, I think I like the monorepo overall. I will probably reuse it in the future also for new projects, but I think it requires to have a lot of awareness, right, about the advantages and disadvantages and the risk, especially. There's always a trade-off, as in everything, and I think in this case, the monorepo actually create a situation where you are always tempted to do something more complicated than needed. So it requires additional effort to keep things simple. Okay, that's my feeling. But I want to know your feelings, so let me know in the comment. Thanks for listening to this podcast also this week. I hope you like the fact and the idea that I'm back with the English episode. As I said at the beginning, I will jump from Italian to English in the next episode, as I was doing in the ending of 2024. And this is even more important for me, again, because I'm no longer working in English every day. So I need to practice English to keep it at a good level. So thanks again for listening. Subscribe to the channel, leave a 5-star review on Spotify, and share the episode with everyone that you think could be interested in the topic. And until next time, happy coding.